Hello, everyone. I'm Richard Ice, the Provost of the College of St. Benedict, St. John's University. I'd like to welcome everyone to the 32nd Annual Peace Studies Conference. For 32 years, we have held this conference, and our Peace Studies program has been a leader in confronting and dealing with controversial and complex moral issues of our time. Our Peace Studies department has been a leader in developing undergraduate curriculum which encourages and enables students to think and act with responsible human freedom and to be capable of effective service to others. They have been at the forefront of civic engagement and engaged learning. The theme for this year's conference, Native Resilience, Overcoming Assimilation Through Education and Action, follows these commitments and traditions of our program. Our presenters are distinguished scholars and, more importantly, practitioners and activists. We're especially delighted to have Winona LaDuke speaking this evening on Native resistance and action, climate change, fossil fuels, and sustainability. Our conference has long been committed to community-based education and is intended to involve the campus and broader community. Indeed, we are also exploring and seeking to understand our own history with assimilation here at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. I'm honored that you have come to our campus today, those of you who are coming to the campus. I'm glad to see so many students here today as well. As with the 31 conferences before, I expect this to be a day of profound dialogue. So I welcome you all here today. And now I'd like to turn the first session over to Dr. Jeff Anderson, the Chair of Peace Studies.
Welcome, and thank you all for coming to this first session. Hopefully you'll be able to stay for many of the others throughout the day. And I want to thank the Provost and Academic Affairs for over 32 years of support for this conference. My role is pretty limited here. I'm not actually doing the first session. I'm just here basically to thank our co-sponsors that made this day all possible. When we started this conference more than 3 decades ago, only one of our co-sponsors existed. That was the sociology department. Now, as we try to focus on some of the crucial issues of the day, we have an abundance of expertise and enthusiasm to build a conference with. This year, we are joined by the Climate Action Club, the Environmental Studies Department, CSB Sustainability, the Sociology Department, Intercultural and International Student Services, the Gender Studies Department, the IWL, which is the Institute for Women's Leadership, the McCarthy Center, and the Mellon Grant. Significant support for the Peace Studies portion of our conference comes from longtime benefactors, Dr. Robert and Lorraine Brighton-Bucher, who, though no longer here with us in body, are most definitely here in spirit. Here in both body and spirit is Sheila Hellerman in the back there. If we could give her a nice round of applause. You will know why in a moment. She is our office coordinator for Peace Studies and many others, but she's truly made this day possible with all the behind-the-scenes work, all the coordination and that. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Ted Gordon, whose vision and organizing, along with Peace Studies Professor Dr. Kelly Kramer, and contributions from all those forementioned, have created the framework for today's events. But none of this could be successful with all of you who've come here today, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for that and continuing this great tradition. So thank you very much. Ted?
The land we stand here on today is the original homeland of the Dakota and the Ojibwe people. We honor and respect the indigenous peoples who were forcibly removed from this land and who are still connected to this land today. At St. Ben's and St. John's, our institutional learning goals call for us to live courageously. And when looking for examples of courageous living, we don't need to look any farther than the Native nations that continue to thrive right here in Minnesota today. The southern part of our state is home to 4 Dakota reservations. Today you will hear speakers from Prairie Island and Lower Sioux. The northern part of the state is home to 7 Ojibwe reservations. And you'll hear speakers who are from or have worked with Mille Lacs, White Earth, Red Lake, and Grand Portage. Our first panel today, this is going to run until 2:05, and our panel is entitled From Assimilation to Revitalization at St. Ben's and St. John's. The history of forced assimilation is one that hits really close to home here. In this panel, we will share our past role and how we've transformed ourselves over time and how we still have a long way to go. Thanks to support from our campus's Becoming Community initiative, I've had the privilege of working with a team of research students supported by staff of monastics. We are investigating St. Ben's and St. John's past and present relations with Native communities in order to serve them on their own terms. This work will never be complete, and we will make mistakes along the way. But we must do it. Our Benedictine values and our institutional learning goals compel us to. On this panel, you will hear the work of our team as we take our first steps towards a 3-part strategy. Unconditional student inclusion, investigating our past, and serving Native communities on their own terms. The 3 parts support each other, creating pillars that can lift us towards revitalization. We must ensure that our campuses are unconditionally inclusive of Native and Indigenous students. Our research has found that all too often in our community has been willing to accept Native and Indigenous students only on the condition that they conceal their identities. We're working to change that. We must learn from our past. Most non-Native Americans know nothing about the fact that our government once used education as a weapon against Native people. Some of our campus histories do include some of our institution's role in this, but unfortunately today, most of our students, faculty, and staff know nothing about it. It should be visible so that we may never forget. In our archives, we've come across photos of hundreds of Ojibwe students who were enrolled in these schools and thousands of pages of documents on them. We are now in the process of sharing these materials with tribal historic preservation officers so that each Native nation affected by these schools has full access to our materials on their relatives. In this way, our historical research serves Native nations, but we cannot stop there. We owe a debt that can never be repaid, but we can ask how we may serve them. We will share some of the first steps that we are taking to match our resources with the needs they have identified. I will begin by making an introduction to the government's attempt to force assimilation. Then our campus archivist, Peggy Roski, will share what she's learned about the industrial schools that were once operated on our campuses. After Peggy, student research assistant Balin Benway will discuss her work with photos and documents from our archives. Then Claire Winters, also a research student, will share some of what she's learned about the boarding school operated by the Order of St. Benedict on the White Earth Reservation. Then we will hear from Sister Phillip Zimmer, who served as a teacher and principal at the St. Mary's Mission School at Red Lake. She will share how the school began with government support for the goal of assimilation, but transformed over time, including during her leadership. Unfortunately, our final speaker won't be able to join us on this panel. Regina Terchik is a student researcher who's taken part in groundbreaking research on the experiences of Native and Indigenous students on our campuses. I will give her presentation. Then I will offer some concluding remarks, returning to our 3-part strategy, and explain how our work towards revitalization is just getting started. If you have any questions, please save them towards the end. Well, we should have some time for a good Q&A session. So, the United States has a long history of using military force to remove Native people from their homelands. There's a shift in that policy beginning in the 1880s. The military force is still very much being used, but there is now an attempt in the 1880s by the government to removed native populations from this land through forced assimilation. There's a shift from military conflict to criminalizing native culture. One of the first parts of this we see is the Code of Indian Offenses from 1883. This made it a crime for native people to practice their spirituality, a crime that was punishable with jail. In fact, the freedom of religion did not apply to native people in the United States until 1978. In 1887, Congress passes the Dawes Act. The intent of this was also to force assimilation. It was to convert native peoples into a culture of Christian farmers. It prohibited tribes from collectively owning reservation land. Instead of being able to manage the land on the reservations as they saw fit, this law required that the reservation lands be divided into 160-acre plots, with each household receiving a plot. When in reality, most allotments were much smaller than this. Many of them were impractical for farming. The Dawes Act also gave reservation land to missionaries, with the goal of giving missionaries access to reservations to be able to convert, especially since native spiritualities have been criminalized. Now, the Dawes Act didn't apply to Minnesota in itself. The Dawes Act applied to Indian Territory at the time. It didn't apply to individual states, and it took individual laws from Congress to then apply the principles of the Dawes Act to each state. So in Minnesota, what we had here was the Nelson Act, which was passed in 1889. And the Nelson Act did the exact same thing that the Allotment Act did. It brought that allotment to Minnesota, and it was secured and passed with the support of Senator Newt Nelson, who it's named after. Senator Newt Nelson was also pivotal in securing funding for the St. Ben's and St. John's industrial schools that you'll hear Peggy present on. In other words, allotment and boarding schools went hand in hand, with allotment having the intent of trying to force family households to assimilate, with boarding schools having the intent to force children to assimilate. And that was done through family separation. The first of these schools that ended up becoming the model for this was the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, founded in 1879 by United States Army General Richard Henry Pratt. The slogan for this school, the motto, was "Kill the Indian, save the man." Here was a United States Army general whose view was that rather than use military force to remove native people from their land, that the United States could eliminate its native population by sending their children away from home to boarding schools. Congress acted to support this model and make it applicable to every native child in the United States. We see in the Indian Appropriations Act of 1891, which called for the Office of Indian Affairs to make and enforce such rules as will secure the attendance of children at schools. And this is specifically schools designed like the Carlisle Indian School with that motto. So what kind of rules did they come up to enforce this? Well, when the United States and tribes were signing treaties, those treaties set aside land, reserved land for tribes, requiring them to cede land to the United States. And as payment for that, in many cases, those treaties said that food rations were to be given to tribes, because when you take away people's ability to, when you take away their land, you take away their ability to feed themselves. And so food rations were part of these treaties in many cases. But one of the rules was that those food rations could be withheld from families that did not send their children to these schools. In other cases as well, parents could be jailed if they didn't send their children to these schools. In some cases, parents had the option to choose which school to send their child to. There were schools, some were military, some were run by, some were Catholic, some were Protestant. In some cases, parents had some choice, but every school had the same curriculum. A half a day of unpaid labor and half a day of classes. And prohibitions against expressions of native languages, spirituality, or culture. Now, when you think about what the government was attempting to do here, This was an incredibly cruel practice. It also is incredibly ambitious at a bureaucratic level, in the sense that on the one hand, you have the government having this rule that every Native child should have the same education. And in order to do that, the government had to enlist many different institutions. Some of those institutions were churches, military operated a number of those schools, and those institutions all had their own goals, resources, and motivations. Some of them were 100% dedicated to the government's goal. Some of them were dedicated to some parts but cared less about others. Every institution was subject to inspection by government officials. And then at each institution, you have a whole bunch of different individuals that are working at those institutions. And some of those individuals may have cared very deeply about the goal of assimilation. Others may not have cared so much. Others may have respected some elements of Native culture at the same time that they were working in a school that may have forbade it. Some of the individuals working at those schools may have cared very deeply about the children that they were working with. Other individuals, there's plenty of evidence as well, other individuals were abusive and should not have been around children in any decade. So the reality is that there is no singular boarding school experience. Instead, institutions varied widely across the country. There were hundreds of these schools, and even individual experiences at those schools could vary tremendously. When talking about the history of the institutions that were operated on our own land here, we need to keep in mind this is the federal context, this is the national context. I'm going to now invite Peggy Roski to come up and to share some more about what she's found about the industrial schools that were once operated on our campus. Thank you. Got yours in here somewhere?
I'll get it.
You got it?
You could have them turn the lights off here and
Oh,
talk to the screen.
Sure.
Okay. There we go. I wanted to start off, first of all, by explaining. I'm the archivist for St. Ben's, the College of St. Benedict, and St. John's University. There are 4 archives on the campuses, though, and the other 2 are the archives for the Abbey, St. John's Abbey, and the archives for the monastery at St. Ben's. I've accessed the resources at the other 2 places to put together what you're going to see today, but the 2 collections I oversee don't include the monasteries or the abbeys. Even from what Ted has said so far this afternoon, you've learned that it's likely that there will be more resources on the Indian industrial schools in the monastic archives than in the college and the university. The college didn't even exist when the Indian industrial schools were created. So every so often I'll have to correct somebody when they say, well, the industrial school at the College of St. Benedict. Whoa, whoa, whoa. College didn't exist for another 30 or so years, even after the industrial school closed. So that's my perspective. I'm not an expert in it. I've dug as deeply as I've had time to into the topic because it's fascinated me ever since I learned about this when I started in the archives about 15 years ago. But you'll find greater experts even among the students that have had more time to dig into this topic than I, so I look forward to hearing what they have to say, and Sister Phillips. I wanted to tell you that there's more information about the history of St. Ben's and St. John's available on the archives websites, so a little plug here if you haven't already experienced this. If you go to the A to Z list up in the corner of any of our web pages and look for archives, for archives, you can come to either the St. John's Archives website or the St. Ben's Archives website. And on this little category there called History Lessons, you can see a gazillion PowerPoints that I've done in various, for various entities. And that includes a couple that I've done on the Indian industrial schools, one for St. Ben's and one for St. John's. I've also done one on, that's called Before the Benedictines, The People Here First, which is my attempt in a brief presentation to explore a little bit about the treaties and the surrounding area. And then there's a couple about Indian Bush, which is what they called the place that the monks first settled on, down by what's now the Wobegon Trail. My goal today is to be informative Also culturally sensitive, historically accurate, and give you some information about a subject for which, despite all the documents that Ted mentioned, are relatively scarce on an important subject. So you'll see a lot of text on my slides. I tend to throw everything in so that it's there for future reference, because I put so many of them up on the web eventually. I also am kind of a stickler for showing my sources, and I also feel like putting more of the writing on the screen accommodates people with different learning styles. So here we go. A couple of things I'm going to mention are available through the publications link. We have the record going back to 1888 online. We have all the alumni magazines. We have several books. We have lots of things. So I mentioned that because that's where you would go if you wanted to look at this particular publication back from 1957, which is a publication that the monks used to put out, and one called the Abbey Quarterly, which is now replaced by the Abbey Banner. So those things are all online and searchable on the archives website. So one that isn't a publication per se, but that I relied on a lot, it's an honors thesis written by Matt Reichert, who teaches FYS. He did this when he was a student and has revised it a little bit since, but he really did some of the work that the students are doing in digging into the archives, especially in the Abbey and also in the monastery, to do this paper that he did on Red Lake, White Earth, and the Black Gowns. So that's also available online in Digital Commons if anybody wants to pursue that. Okay, I said written records are scarce, but here's one of the bulletins or catalogs that was put out for the Indian industrial schools. This one happened to be for both places, so it says fathers and sisters. We still don't have the lights turned off. It would be useful to be able to see this a little better. Thanks, Aaron. And it's put out both for the industrial school at St. John's and at St. Ben's and at White Earth. And because of the wonders of the Abbey, Peter Engel, the scientist after whom the science building is named, started a photo studio here in the 1800s. So we have photos that we otherwise would not have, and that includes photos of students and teachers in the Indian Industrial School, mostly on the St. John's campus, but some at St. Ben's. So here's an example of those gallery photos, most of which do not have the names of the students given, unfortunately. Otherwise, I have lots of documents, their contracts, things from the Department of the Interior, the Indian Affairs, the Bureau of Indian Missions, etc., financial records and letters to and from the abbot. Those things are in one of the archives on campus, many of them in the Abbey archives. Here's a group shot of the Indian Industrial School at St. John's, which was from 1884 to 1896, and St. Ben's, which lasted 2 years longer. And as I mentioned, the St. Ben's community also ran the mission school up at White Earth on the reservation. Okay, the beginnings. Rupert Seidenbush, who had been an abbot at St. John's, he was appointed to be the first bishop and archbishop in this vicinity of Minnesota. He asked Benedictines to minister to the Indians at White Earth, and Father Aloysius volunteered to be the first one. Then Rupert asked St. Ben's to provide teachers for White Earth, so Sisters Philomena and Leoba Brown were sent to meet the challenge. They arrived at White Earth with the bishop in 1878, and Father Aloysius's ministry covered like 5 million square miles, the 80 miles between White Earth and Red Lake among them. And so here's a quote from Worship and Work, the history book about St. John's. So during the first 2 years, he gained sufficient mastery of the language to preach to the Indians while he was going around visiting everybody. And the Benedictines and the Indians desired to have churches and schools. There was an existing government school on the reservation that was run by non-Catholics, but the Catholic Indians wanted to have their children instructed in the Catholic faith. Father Aloysius remained at White Earth, by the way, until he died in 1929. President Grant had a plan for the American Indian he called a peace policy when he was running for office. Here's a quote about that. In justice, the nation owed the Indian restitution and the opportunity to become an active citizen instead of a ward of the government. The plan was highly idealistic, and the U.S. is still attempting to realize that ideal. Indian schools to be placed in charge of religious groups were a prominent part of the program, as Ted has already mentioned. The peace policy involved Catholic Indians. Well, in that particular situation, part of the situation is that there were Protestant denominations who were running schools and missions up north, and not the Catholics. And so the Catholics from here wanted to get involved. Many of the Native Americans who had been converted to the Christian religion had been done so in terms of them having been descended from the French voyageurs and had those pieces in their background as well. So the aim of the policy was to foster more humanitarian treatment, but it actually fostered bigotry both between the white people and the Native Americans and the Catholics and the Protestants. So things got kind of involved. Here's Nelson, previously mentioned, later became Governor Nelson. So with the condition of the Indians in northern Minnesota and the limited number of schools in mind, Congressman Nelson asked Alexius, the abbot here, to help in educating the Indian boys and girls of the White Earth Reservation. And the consensus was that if the children's education was to be effective, schools should be provided off the reservations because parents interfered too much and caused irregularities in procedure. I'll say more about that later. In July, the abbot wrote to Reverend Stephan, who was the director of the Catholic Indian Bureau, and asked him to arrange a contract so that the abbot could start an Indian school here. He wrote, "There could be no better place for educating Indian boys, and White Earth has plenty of Chippewa Indian boys who would embrace the opportunity." After the congressman obtained permission for the abbot to get into the education of Chippewa Indians, they signed a contract. Here's one of them. There are several on file in the Abbey archives. So the government contract allowed for 50 boys to be trained at St. John's and 50 girls to be trained at St. Ben's to pay $167 a year. And that was to cover everything, getting them here, feeding them, clothing them, providing school supplies, educating them, etc. Here's Abbot Alexius Edelbrock, and he said if this was a new experience for the fathers and brothers, and the first students ranged from 10 to 17 in age. Leaving home for 3 years of boarding school life was not accepted by all the boys and their parents with the pleasure that Abbot Alexius had anticipated. And needless to say, that's an understatement, and also applied to the girls coming from St. Ben's. After being here a few days, 3 boys ran off and went back to White Earth, spread a lot of lies, stirred up the old folks, and so some of the parents came down to inspect, found everything okay and went back. But then another one came down and took his boys and girls from St. Ben's and St. John's. Several parents came down and took their children home. We have yet 24 boys here, and I hope they will soon clear out. I've had enough of this, he said. And then the guy at the Bureau of Catholic Indian Missions wrote back and said, "I regret to hear of your troubles with the Indian boys and trust that matters will end soon. I can't see in what way they could lend a helping hand, for there is no law or regulation that forbids or can stop Indians from taking their children away from the schools. Indian parents have the same rights over their children that whites have over theirs." The Reverend Roman Homar was interviewed about his experiences as one of the teachers for the Indian industrial schools. And so I've got some quotes from him, and that's a picture that shows him with some of the students. He noted that it was only a grade school. The boys went out and would get out and get jobs. As Ted said, they worked half of the day and went in school the other half of the day. So they went down to the barn to learn about keeping horses and cows and butchery and carpentry. They learned stationery, engineering, and helped in the butcher shop, et cetera, et cetera. They came almost entirely from the reservations at White Earth, Red Lake, Sand Lake, et cetera. Here's an example of the negative. Mr. John Morrison was interviewed and said that during his years at the school, no music or singing were held, and that English was sometimes taught by a teacher who could not speak English. They were largely German speakers still at this point. The old stone house, which you can see here on the far end of the quad, the far south end, it's no longer there, but its upper rooms were dormitories for the boys, and the south wing, the building next to it, which does still exist, were used for additional space. Here's a picture of some of the Indian boys at the shoe shop. And so that was in the old stone house, which was torn down in 1893. So the program of getting off-reservation schools for up to 3 years of training, the pupils were from 9 to 15 years old, and here's a few examples of some of the photos that exist in the Abbey archives, which unfortunately we do not have names for. They had rules. They were put up in front of the room in a picture frame. Discipline was very severe. They were punished when they deserved it, but they often got more than they deserved, as this writer says. One boy had the record of getting 6 whippings in one day. The rules included students must be respectful, they are to engage in actual labor. The boys who would not learn trade or farming are required to do other works. Idleness is banished. Use of tobacco was prohibited. Quarterly reports were required to be sent to their parents, and parents could not withdraw them unless specified in the contract with the government. By modern standards, discipline was extremely strict, but was not peculiar to the Indian school. This is the 1800s. Kids got whipped, not just Native Americans. Since the Indian boys' parents, though, never gave the slightest physical punishment because it was considered an extreme insult, the students were bound to resent the corrective means that were typical of many schools in the 1880s. When the tornado hit St. John's in 1894, the Indian Industrial School was hit. It was in the path. The old stone house next to it had been torn down the year before, so the next building bore the brunt. It was noted that Father Roman and Brother Sudford risked their lives getting all the boys to safety before the twister pulled half the roof off the south wing, which was later rebuilt and made another floor higher, so now it matches the rest of the quad. When applications to come to the school dwindled, the monks went up and traveled around to recruit students. Although young Chippewas did not like the idea of going to the school, their efforts and the government's later stand on compulsory education served as secured an annual total for up to 150 students. Here's Roman again, who says, it took a lot of coaxing, and parents asked if the kids if they wanted to go. If they said yes, they went. If they said no, they didn't. The Indian father said, you better ask. The old woman, meaning the mother, I asked the mother, and if she said no, they didn't go. They were given a free choice if they wanted to go to school or not. But from 1900 on, the government made school compulsory. Well, by then, these two schools no longer existed. They closed in 1894 and 1896 and 1898. They had organizations and baseball teams, which provided opportunities for them. I had a person do his dissertation on the Indian baseball teams in Indian industrial schools several years back, and as he noted here, the absence of monastics in the photograph and in the team's leadership provided opportunities for Native autonomy and cultural persistence. Here's a shot of the baseball game. You can see the cross of the Abbey Cemetery in the distance that tells you it's out by where Emmaus Seminary baseball field is now. Here's a couple of pages from a catalog talking about the medals that were given out at the end of the year. So students found life difficult to take. Some of them would go run off in the spring, but it was noted that they would work on farms and learn things that they would go back to the reservations and be leaders in their communities. Here's one of the contracts talking about the rate, and it's to Abbot Alexius, and pupil selection and reports showing the status of the students was given. St. Ben's Industrial School was established, and I've got some slides here that I'll go through quickly because time is short, but the Industrial School for St. Ben's was in a building 3-story high and solid brick, comfortable and commodious, etc. They were taught reading, orthography, which has to do with use of language, grammar, arithmetic, penmanship, etc., and different kinds of ornamental needleworks and things that women would have to know in the future. The aerial photo here shows the building that was the Indian Industrial School, which was torn down in 2007, but that's where it used to be. Names of the students reflect their different ancestry. Here are some pictures. The program was short-lived. The policy of the government of building schools on the reservation took over, and so more and more students would go to the reservations and stay on the reservations to go to these schools. Request, I have honestly and before God not made 1 cent on my Indian pupils under under the contract I have and still have, I've lost money. And if it were not for the good cause, I would not keep the children here. This is from Abbot Alexius. Indians are under our care, and we must bring sacrifices for them if we wish to get them to heaven. That, in a nutshell, is the basic motivator for why the various religious groups were trying to do this. They weren't in it for the money. Then it got into a story about the Catholics and whether the government should be paying for separation of church and state issues, whether the government should be paying to instruct people in a religious school. So the upshot, the Catholic Indian schools were obliged to depend on their own resources, and so ultimately the schools closed. And so then the Benedictines took over educating them up on the reservations. That's the end, and I look forward to hearing any questions you might have later. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. It is incredible the work that she's been able to do in looking in what is in our archives, and it's really important as well to think about all of that within the national context. Because when you look in the archives, you can see notes where they say that the schools became compulsory in 1900 after the schools here had closed, when federal law made it compulsorily about a decade earlier. Our next presenter is Balin Benway, who has done some exciting research in the monastic archives, again separate from the Abbey archives, and also online using a wonderful website that Peggy introduced, and Balin has more to share about. So let me pull this up for you. There you go.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Balin, and I'm a junior communication major here over at St. Ben's. And I've been working as an undergraduate research assistant with Professor Ted Gordon. So a little quick background about myself is that I'm Dakota Mdewakanton Sioux from Prairie Island in southeast Minnesota. You could call me Kea Watch They Win. My culture was a big part of my life growing up, so that's why I feel like this work is important and needed. This past summer and last semester, I've had the privilege of working as a research assistant on a couple of projects that I want to share a little bit about with you all. As you all previously heard, there were Native American industrial schools right here in our campus that many people don't even know about. I believe this information is important to acknowledge, so essentially, my job is working on sharing this information. For the most part, I've been working on two main projects, both dealing with archival work. The first project is going through the photographs of the industrial schools in the archives over at St. Ben's and categorizing and identifying who the children are in the photos and what tribes they are from. There are two separate archives, one at St. John's and the other at St. Ben's. Specifically, I've been working with the archives at St. Ben's. While I collect photos from the St. Ben's industrial schools, I also collect photos that were taken at the missions in White Earth and Red Lake. What this looked like was searching through all of the photos the archives had and identifying which ones were relevant to this project. After we identified the photos, we scanned them and then grouped them by separate tribes. So far, we've ended up with over 150 photographs. The end goal for this project is sharing these photos with their respective tribes. It's important to also know that some of these photos haven't been seen in over 100 years, and they are finally now being shared with their respective Native communities. So, as you can see in this photo, there are 3 Native American men in front of the mission at White Earth, and this photo was taken in 1880. These are 2 more examples of the photos that I would look through and categorize. The one on the right is a class photo, and the one on the left is a small group photo of a few of the older students attending the school. Both of these photos were taken at the St. Ben's Girls' School in the late 1800s. The second project that I've been working on is categorizing the articles found on the online St. Ben's and St. John's archives called Vivarium. Our campus newspaper, The Record, has been digitalized, and through Vivarium, you can now search articles online going all the way back to the 1880s when the industrial schools were first opened. I've categorized and searched key terms such as industrial school, Mille Lacs, Leech Lake, Fond du Lac, White Earth, and Red Lake. We have been focusing on the Ojibwe tribes of Minnesota because it was these tribes that were affected by the schools on our campus. But I've also been doing some research on the other Native communities in Minnesota. So far, I've recorded over 500 topics. After finding these articles, I've created a searchable catalog of the articles so that we can go through them and analyze how our institution's publications have represented Native American communities for over 130 years. These articles are important to record so that we can remember our past at this school. One article I found was about the early beginnings of the industrial schools. I was able to learn about the small first class of boys at the St. John's School, which only included 50 Ojibwe students. This specific article I read then goes into talk about how these boys would be instructed in mental and manual training. These articles also talked about how the governor of Minnesota visited a few times to speak with the industrial school students. I recently unearthed another article about the tornado that ripped through the school and the living quarters in 1894. Luckily, no lives were lost in this storm, and the reconstruction of the buildings started shortly after. From these articles being documented, we were also able to learn about the day on December 1st, 1889, when two chiefs from Mille Lacs named Little Wolf and Moonlight came to inspect the school. These are interesting pieces of information that we have to learn about our very own school. Throughout this research, it also gave me the chance to explore a little bit of my own community back home and make connections with my community here at CSB SJU. I learned about how there were protests against the nuclear power plant that was being placed right on the Prairie Island Reservation. Our school protested this power plant in 1994, and it's this type of information that makes me feel a stronger connection between both of my communities. Every single one of these articles being documented will help make it easier to have access to this knowledge so that our complex history at this school isn't being forgotten, but acknowledged and remembered. Thank you.
Thank you, Balin. Next up is another research assistant, Claire Winters, who will talk about some of the research that she's done on the school at White Earth. There we go.
Hello, my name, as mentioned, is Claire Winters. I am a senior sociology and environmental studies double major here at St. Ben's and St. John's. What I'm doing specifically is I am looking at the school on the White Earth Reservation rather than taking a holistic look at how it interacted with everything else. So in 1878, the school was founded, as previously mentioned by Peggy, by Father Aloysius, Lioba Braun, and Philomene Kenton. They came as sort of a group, and they were the founding members, and they all stayed there until their deaths. So this was an operation that was expanded in the late 1890s by donations from Catherine Drexel. She was essentially a philanthropist of mission schools. She saw it as her goal to, her words were essentially to humanize the population. So what she did was she committed money to the school and throughout her life was a benefactor of the White Earth Mission School. And so she helped expand the building. Near the end of the 1800s, the school was receiving less and less federal money as the federal government was transitioning away from religious-based schools to military-based schools. So they relied more and more on philanthropic funding like hers. So another thing to note is that the operations as a boarding school closed about 1945 or 1946. At that point, it became a day school for about 20 years and then it closed completely. During that time, there was about 150 students at any time. Many of them were orphans, and about 2,000 people, all girls, came through this school. They had no formal language ban, which was the main reason we looked into this in the first place. Formal language bans on speaking the native language is pretty standard, and while it was discouraged, there wasn't anything in place to outlawed outright on the campus. So my research has mainly worked in the monastic archives. I've also looked outside the archives to find anything that hasn't been in there, such as government documents or interviews or transcripts. Some of the students have contributed to anthologies, which we'll get into later. After that, I've taken the data I've collected, I've summarized it, put it into relevant documents, connected it together, and used that to finalize information or look for more information. I've also interviewed a couple people, one of which was a nun named Carol Berg. She did a thesis in the 1980s on the White Earth Reservation. It's called Climbing Learner's Hill, Benedictines at White Earth. So she was very helpful because she interviewed a lot of the a couple of the students and many of the nuns who worked there. She interviewed about 10 students. And so what we're doing is we're looking more into their lives and using them to go off that, to find more students and see if we can find anything else. So about the students specifically, they had a lot to say about how the school was run. More specifically, they did feel very uncomfortable throughout their time there with the way things were treated because, for obvious reasons, this was essentially a way to get their culture away from them. A lot of them talked specifically about how there was a specific emphasis on patriotism in a lot of their classes, and that things were very strict. It was very gendered, everything was a certain way, there was very much insistence on perfection, and they talked a lot about how the things they learned there undermined tribal authority and also their familial structure, which was a specific problem because they were away from their families for 9 months at a time. And so the goal right now is to look more into the students' lives. Who were they? What did they do? This is hard to do because most of them died in the 70s or 80s, so they don't leave a digital trace. What other physical traces they have, obviously we don't have them. So one person we do know about is named Rose Barstow. This is a photo of her taken in the 70s. This photo is courtesy of the University of Minnesota Archives because she was a professor there. She was a co-founder of the native languages. At the U of M, she taught Ojibwe, and she also spent some of her time working on a dictionary. This quote is actually from one of the anthologies I mentioned. It was published in the early 70s. It was edited by a woman called Jane Katz, who was an anthropologist, and it's called I Am the Fire of Time. In this, she's talking about an event at the school, and more specifically, this is an event concerning who we believe to be Father Aloysius. She doesn't say. So what she's talking about is a textbook, and it says, in the 4th grade, we were studying a book on colonial history. I said, these are awful people. She said, why, my girl, you're one of those savages. We came here to civilize you. After that, she ran away. It's about a 2-page quote, hence why it's condensed like this. And so after a couple days, the priest came to talk to her, and he said, these are lies about you people, try to forgive. And he gave her an orange, which for those of you that don't know, citrus fruit was very rare during that time because it didn't really travel to Minnesota well. And then in the summer when I went home, I told Grandpa about that book, and he said, now, Rose, I want you to learn English. I want you to learn all the words in the dictionary. Someday you will be a teacher, and you will write the truth about our people. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And next, I have the pleasure of inviting up Sister Phillip Zimmer, who will talk about her work at the St. Mary's Mission at Red Lake. I'll put the title slide back on.
Thank you, Ted, for your introduction. And a special thank you, Peggy, for your insightful presentation on those industrial schools here at St. John's and at St. Ben's. And I really want to commend Balin and Claire for their zeal in their research. I think it's just really wonderful. And thank you for your research, fruits of your research. So moving on from the presentation on the industrial schools, we travel some 180 miles north to St. Mary's Mission in Red Lake. I had the privilege of being with the Ojibwe people for 17 years, working in the mission school in elementary education. I hope to acquaint you briefly on the beginning of the mission school and bring you to the present day to trace the learning and the activities that reflect the title of this gathering, which is the St. Mary's Mission School, Assimilation and Revitalization. My primary source for this presentation comes from this book, Full of Fair Hope. It's a history of St. Mary's Mission, written by Sister Owen Lindblad. It was published in 1997. And after the program is over, you may have an opportunity to meet Sister Owen, because she is with us today. The beginnings of St. Mary's Mission School had a very different beginning than most boarding schools, and I'll share that with you. But as time went on, the government had a voice in how it was to be run, and hence that same dictate that English was to be the only language by the staff and the children. And as with other schools, any speaking of the native tongue was to end with punishment. Now back to the school's beginning. Prior to 1884, there was a sporadic service of priests to St. Mary's Mission. At one point, Father Piers brought a young priest, Father Lawrence Laudisher, to be a resident pastor. But unfortunately, this zealous man froze to death on Red Lake on December 3rd, 1858, returning from visiting a sick parishioner about 12 miles from the mission. And then after that, there was little pastoral care for that young parish in Red Lake. Then, dated October 11th, 1884, a letter came to Abbot Alexius Edelbrook from Chief Littlefender requesting a resident pastor. In his best try in broken English, he addressed Father Habit to have Father Aloysius Hermanitz, who you've heard now a few times, his name came up, to come as a pastor, because he had come to Red Lake a few times each year for Mass. But for Chief Littlefender, that wasn't satisfactory. So along with the request for a resident pastor, the chief made reference to a promise by the Commission of Indian Affairs that if a resident pastor was in place, the current school on the reservation would be turned over to the mission. Chief Littlefender's signature was followed by 112 signatures, most of them with an X behind them for their mark, because these men were at that time illiterate. Abbot Edelbrook granted Chief Littlefender's request. Father Aloysius Hermanitz was assigned to St. Mary's Mission. This fulfilled the request This fulfilled the request that signals the beginning of St. Mary's Mission School. And as you saw on the screen, in 1888, 2 Benedictine sisters arrived at the mission to teach at the school. There were 25 students, but no books, blackboards, or slates. The school did flourish, and in 1889, the school became a boarding school. A contract was made with the federal government to cover student costs. And since English was the language to be spoken, there was little participation by the students. However, Ojibwe was spoken in the non-school times, with some of the priests and sisters learning the language as they interacted with the children during their recreation times. Ball games of various kinds, sliding down the hill and cardboard during the winter months. They didn't have toboggans or sleds. And they also spoke during the time that the children helped with the house or the outside farm work that kept the mission going. In 1940, the school ceased to be a boarding school, and rumors were abundant that without government funding, the school would close. This was not the case. It was run on a shoestring budget, but it continued with good enrollment. The mission even purchased a bus to bring the children to school. But unfortunately, by this time, the language was pretty well gone. Once the school was under the direction of the Diocese of Crookston and operated by the staff at St. Mary's Mission, more effort was made to integrate the Ojibwe culture. The non-Indian staff was not equipped to do this, But since it was no longer a boarding school, families could participate together more fully in living their way of life. In 1970, the local famed artist Patrick Desjardins visited the school to teach children Indian ways, and his artwork illustrates the many facets of Indian life. And while I was at the mission school, the tribe had an instructor of the Ojibwe language come to the classroom each week, and along with this, a weekly beading class was held in each classroom, and two of the sisters picked up on the beading, so the art continued through with the students. And Brother Julius Beckerman had learned the language through, Father Julius is actually from St. John's Abbey here, had learned the language through schooling at Bemidji State and the tutoring of the elders. And Father Julius's primary job was to do pastoral ministry with the people. So Father Julius learned the language and with the elders, and he prayed this Lord's Prayer with the children in the school. And then later on, Sister Stephen Kerpiers worked further in having them pray it on a regular basis. And unfortunately, I'm not very adept at languages, so I never learned it very well. But the hallways and rooms in the school had taken on cultural motifs. And when a local storyteller, Johnny Appleseed, was available, he'd come to share their legends. And these legends are only told during the winter months. And the children just loved it when he came because he acted out everything that he was telling. It was just precious. And during the time I was principal, each week we would begin the week with a smudging ceremony where burning sweetgrass or sage is swept over a person in a purifying and healing prayer. And the ritual is performed by one of the Ojibwe employees of the school. And the student body and staff gathered in the gym each morning for a prayer circle to begin the day, the circle being an important form of Native gathering. A spring school powwow had been a tradition through the years, and the boys from the school and their instructors would offer their drum for the occasion. And weather permitting, we'd invite the elders from the local nursing home to be our special guests. The Christmas program, recalling the nativity story, would end with Mary and Joseph in traditional dress holding a live baby Jesus for the finale applause. And I always remember with great enjoyment that one year we had twins. So we had two performances a day. So one twin got to be baby Jesus in the morning, in the afternoon, the other one in the evening. And this current pastor, Father Jerry, enhances special feasts with a drum group playing during the school liturgy. During this time, outside groups wishing to learn more of the culture would come to the mission school during the school year. And years back, at the time of the January term, CSB students came for a week to be with the school children. And since the college calendar no longer has that program, there have been college students choosing to come to the mission school for the alternative break experience for the past 5 years. And Sister Marina Schlungen and I have been the advisors for these students during 4 out of these 5 years. And it's a joy to see the reciprocal interaction between the mission school children and the college students. This visit by the students ends with a dinner in which elders are invited to share stories and culture with these young people. And that's one of the highlights of their time at Red Lake. And we were so sad this spring, there was a storm right at the end of your ABE time. And we came back on Friday night instead of Saturday. And so they missed that dinner. And they were very, very gloomy faces. So many efforts have been made over the years for the Native people to reclaim their culture. And hopefully sensitivity on the part of us non-Indian people will assist these efforts in restoring what was so rightfully theirs and had been taken from them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Phillip. Our last presenter, Regina Terchik, unfortunately isn't here for her presentation. She had another obligation. She will be joining us later if you want a chance to be able to talk with her. She will be around for other events. So Regina, along with another student, Sophie Koloski, who's since graduated, they've done some really exciting research last year. We're carrying on this research this year as well. And this looks into the experiences of Native and Indigenous students on our campuses today. When I first was talking with Regina about this project about 2 years ago at this point, she believed that she could even be the only Native or Indigenous student on campus at the time. She is Yupik, meaning that she's Indigenous to Alaska, from a village community on the coast of Alaska. And at the time, she didn't know anyone else who was Native. And we looked it up and realized, actually, there are a number of other students who identify as Native here on campus. What you see on this chart are the percentage of students who identify as Native, and in yellow, that's the percentage at St. Ben's and St. John's. In blue is the average for Minnesota private colleges. The years here, it's a little small, I don't know if you can see it, but it runs from 1990 up to 2017. And the percentage here, at the bottom of the chart is at 0. At the top is 0.9. So what really should pop out in looking at this is we've actually had a large growth in the number of students who identify as Native. Up until about 2010, we were well below the average for Minnesota private colleges. Now we're above average. And for a little bit of perspective, Minnesota as a state is 1.4% Native. So if an institution were to be at 1.4%, then that would be proportional representation for the state population. So we've actually had a big growth, and what does this number actually translate to? It means that in any given year we have at least 20 to 30 students who identify as being Native, but we have reason to believe that the number is actually higher than that, because there's a standardized questionnaire that's used for this when students enroll in the college, where they basically are given 6 racial categories and told to pick one, whatever one best matches them. A lot of students, a lot of people have multiple identities. They may identify as Native and white, or Native and Hispanic, or Native and black. And if they identify as multiple ones, then they're not captured on this. There's a separate category for people who identify as 2 or more. There also are a lot of students who identify as Indigenous to other places in North and South America. And so we've had interviews with students who say, well, my family is Indigenous to Mexico. Our primary language isn't Spanish, it's an Indigenous language, but when looking at this questionnaire, I wasn't going to choose Native American, I chose Hispanic. But so the actual numbers could be much higher. So we want to know how they're doing. And so working with Regina and Sophie, the idea here was that what's the best way to understand how our Native and Indigenous students are doing? And that is for Native and Indigenous students to do the interviews themselves and to develop the questions. Regina being Indigenous, Sophie as well being mine. She's an Indigenous to Guatemala. The idea is for them to come up with these questions. I provided some of the guidance and some of the structure, but it was really up to them. And we were using something known as standpoint theory. The idea is that the extent to which an oppressed group situation is different from that of the dominant group, its dominated situation enables the production of distinctive kinds of knowledge. The social and political disadvantage can be turned into advantage. In other words, as a white professor, I'm in a position of privilege, and that means that there's certain things that I can't see. I can't see what it's like to be a Native or Indigenous person on this campus. I can't even have a good idea of what it's really like to be a student here. If I want to know what those experiences are, I need to go and empower individuals from those communities to be able to develop the questions, to be able to investigate that themselves, because they'll know questions to ask that I won't even think about. And indeed they did. Regina and Sophie came up with incredible questions that I wouldn't have even thought about. And we set about doing interviews to find out how our Native and Indigenous students are doing on campus. And one of the, a benefit of this structure as well is that the interviews were being done by Native and Indigenous students, so they could both build trust, but also build a connection with somebody who, in just about every case, they didn't know beforehand was a Native or Indigenous student. We recruited Participants by flyer and social media. We said anyone who identifies with any community, native or indigenous to North or South America. Last year we conducted 7 interviews, and we have more that we'll be doing this year. And participants range from Alaska down to South America. I'm going to share with you some of the results. One of the things that we did was we ensured confidentiality of everyone. So the names that you're going to see are pseudonyms. They're not their actual names. A common pattern that we found is that unfortunately a number of students felt that in many circumstances that they had to conceal their identities. Anna, who is an alum and who identifies as Ojibwe, shared a story about being this was during her first year in the dorm with somebody who she had met within the first few weeks of being in college. And she said, I felt like we were becoming friends. She asked me, you must be Italian. And I said, no, I'm Native American. She replied, oh, do you scalp people? And I was like, I'm not going to try this again. I'm 18. And so unfortunately at that point, she didn't tell anyone. And she believed she was the only student who was Native or Indigenous. And what's unfortunate is that there were other students at the same time who felt that way as well. In other cases, students shared their identity with others, but and they had their friends that thought that was great, but it then itself became a burden upon those students. For Irma, who identifies as Kachekal, she's indigenous to Guatemala, she said, sometimes I want to express my indigeneity more freely and educate people, but I also don't want to because I feel like I have to explain myself, and maybe I don't always want to. It's exhausting to find a balance. For Irma and other students, sometimes they would tell a friend, and the friend would say, that's great, I have a whole bunch of questions that I want to ask you. And for that student in that case, it then becomes a burden for them. They just want to hang out and be a college student and not have the burden of trying to explain their identities to others. So what we found is that there were a number of cases where students believe that they may have been the only student who was indigenous or native, and that's because they were being very guarded about who they shared this identity with. But this doesn't have to be the way that it is. And just doing these interviews themselves is starting to connect people on this campus so that nobody has to feel that they are the only one. We also found some experiences of students feeling like they were tokenized in the classroom. Julio, who identifies as Huateco, indigenous to Mexico, said, in class, I feel like sometimes I'm being used for having a different perspective. I feel like my peers win more of me in the class than I win of having them in class. And so what happens in some cases here is a well-meaning instructor may call on a student to go and share a perspective from their identity, which then again becomes a burden for that student to share that other students don't have to. So we developed a number of recommendations. We need to have classes focused on Native and Indigenous issues. We need to have programming and events focused on these issues. We need to have a visible acknowledgement of the industrial schools. And I'm happy to share some of the first steps that we've been taking. Bringing back to the 3-part strategy I used, I shared at the beginning. In terms of investigating our shared history, we have photos and documents that we're sharing with tribal historic preservation officers so that they can have these materials that can help them learn more about their past as well. And we're working on a visible acknowledgement as well. I'll have more news to share about that. We're working with Peggy and some others to have a visible acknowledgement on our campus of the industrial schools. And we're working on ways that we can serve Native communities on their own terms. Last year, we began a partnership with Nayashing, a tribal school at Mille Lacs, where twice we had students from their school come to our campus, and twice we had faculty and students from our campus visit their institution with the goal of increasing college access. Balin was part of this, along with Regina, where we wanted some of the Native high school students at Nayashing to be able to meet Native college students here. To learn what life is like. We also are developing a number of research projects done in collaboration with Native communities. I'm really excited about them, but I'm not going to share any of them with you at this moment. If you'd like to know more, we can talk about that later, and there's a number of opportunities. And we've got some really great work we're doing in terms of Native inclusion on campus. In terms of new courses developed on Native histories and cultures, those are being developed. And will be offered soon. We've got workshops, training for faculty and staff And we've got programming right now. If you have the chance, please visit the Why Treaties Matter exhibit, which is at the College of St. Benedict at the Clemens Library. It'll be there through the end of the month. Fine Arts Programming is bringing Robert Mirabel, a native musician and Grammy winner, who will be on campus on February 17th. And we've got this conference and a lot more programming to come. And so we are making some steps. There's a lot of work to do, but we're going to get there. We do have some time now, a little bit of time for a Q&A. The next panel will start at 2:30. And I do want to make a quick announcement as well that our keynote speech tonight, Winona LeDuc, has been moved to another venue. It'll be in the Pellegrin Auditorium. So now we have some time for some questions. I'd like to bring our panelists up to sit along the table. If somebody, thank you for getting the lights. And if you have a question, maybe the best way to do this is for somebody to go, if you have a question, to go up to the mic and ask them there. Thank you. Maybe we're kind of over there. People might be able to see a little better.
Hi, thank you guys so much for presenting today. I really appreciated everything you had to say. My name is Elijah Henderson. I'm a junior at St. John's. The question I have, and maybe you guys don't have the answer, but maybe you do, and maybe it's just a misunderstanding on my part, but from what I heard, the industrial schools, like the half day that they were working, like unpaid labor, like I heard it was basically kind of like slave labor in a sense, like where they were just being forced to do things that they probably wouldn't want to do, but it was just like, you got to do this. So I guess is maybe if you guys can maybe go in a little bit more depth on that.
So what I'll say is that in terms of what there's two sources of information. First, that's a fantastic question. And there is a word for unpaid labor that is forced, and the most appropriate word for that would really be slavery. Now, we've got kind of two sources of information about this. We have the materials right now, the materials that are in our archives, which are written from a very particular point of view of those who were in charge of the school here. We also have research from hundreds of other schools like this. And so when you look at, this was something that was mandated by the government. Many institutions saw that labor as financially valuable. There are many schools that had placement programs where children, especially girls, would be put in homes to do housework that was unpaid. There are other institutions where when local workers would go on strike, they would send in children to do essentially scab labor. Now, we don't have information about those practices happening here in terms of the house placements and and going in for workers on strike. We just have materials about the kinds of labor that they did. You see a shoe shop, woodworking. There are a couple other things like that. But this was at a time period when these schools were operating, when the federal government was requiring children to attend one of these schools, and parents could be punished if they didn't, and so they didn't have a choice necessarily. And we don't know what their labor conditions were like. That's kind of all that I have to share. That's all that we know, other than I will say that I think that the terminology that you use there of slavery is when we're talking about unpaid labor, especially children, I think that is an appropriate word to use. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
I'd like to make a comment in relation to the people that were at the boarding school at Red Lake. I think one of the things that was helpful for inclusivity of the students and the staff is that they worked together in everything that they did. And I was just going to try to find a quotation. Sister Owen really interviewed literally hundreds of people who had attended the boarding school. And it's a good thing she did when she did, because as I was reading these names, and I said, oh, this person has died, this one has died. So it was very timely when she wrote this. But I think they saw themselves, they worked hard, but I think they also saw themselves almost in a family situation where they were contributing to the good and the welfare of the school itself, because they lived there, they ate there, they slept there, so it was almost like a family setting that they did the kind of work that they did. And one of the ones that I remember, because this woman was a very good friend of mine all the time, I was at Red Lake, she talked about, she peeled potatoes all the time, and she said, my apron had just a real spotted place where I held the potato to peel it. It was just such a dear little thing that she had recorded in here. But I don't think they viewed it as much like a slavery as being part of a family and helping out with this larger family setting.
Thank you. There were a wide range of experiences at these schools, and thank you for sharing that. What are we have time for another question?
Hello. I'm just wondering what it's like, if you've given any of those photos back to relatives, what it's like, or if you have any sort of response, or is it like rewarding to be able to do that?
Thank you. So I've done the actual work. I've done the reaching out to the tribal historic preservation officers. Balin has been one of those who's along with Peggy, and who had a research assistant as well, who's done some of the work of actually digitizing them to be shared. So I don't know if either one of you or both of you want to speak to the work of digitizing, and then I can share some of the responses I've had so far.
We've got, excuse me, the collection of photos that were in the Abbey archives are now in the university archives because they're getting more use there. I have a student who intends to submit a proposal to the Minnesota Digital Libraries, which is online, and you can go and view all sorts of historical documents pertinent to the state of Minnesota. So she is going to hopefully do a project to have all of those photos digitized and made available online. Like I think I said in my talk, very few of them have students identified by name. The teachers sometimes, and the monks and sisters, but not the students themselves. And in Ted's correspondence with Jamie from, was she from White Earth? We are hoping that, first of all, that the members of the tribe will be okay with us making them more widely available. And secondly, if there's any they object to, we wouldn't do that. But that hopefully some of the students in the pictures might be identified by their ancestors, or their descendants, excuse me, so that we'd have more information about those images.
In terms of the photographs that I've been going through, it's been a really rewarding process. Just being able to see some of these photos, like I said before, haven't been seen in over 100 years. And also some of the photographs, just lining up for what year the photographs were taken, and then the catalog year, we were able to identify some of the children in the photographs. I'm not a part of the process right now of showing them to the relatives and stuff, but that's just been getting started just now. So hopefully as time goes on, I'll be able to see more of that, but it's a really exciting process.
Thank you. Yeah, each tribe that was affected by one of these schools has what's known as a tribal historic preservation officer, who's in charge of a number of things, including their archives. And so one of the things that we've been doing with these digitized photos is reaching out to them, and the responses so far have been very positive. These are photos that many of them have already said they have some of their own projects that for their own tribes that this would be very helpful for. And last February, we were fortunate to have a number of tribal leaders speak at an event on our campus, and we shared some photos there. And one of the things that we heard at that time was, this could be used in some of our museums. We can share this with families, and so that's probably among some of the most rewarding part of this research. Thank you. We are out of time. That is all the time we have. The next panel starts at 2:30. Thank you all for coming.